Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 3 of Genki 3rd edition. There's a lot of good stuff going on in this chapter, mainly focusing on verbs. And there's also a lot of good stuff going on in my life. I have a table now, which means that I have this mouse pad that lets me use this mouse pointer thingy to show you exactly what I'm talking about at any given time. A little bit less nice is that it took a while to put this lesson together, meaning that my beard just keeps growing, and if I don't pick up the pace, I will end up as a literal caveman before finishing this book. So let's not make that happen. So, moving on. Like I said, verbs. This chapter focuses on verbs, and there are 3 kinds of verbs in Japanese. Genki classifies them as reverbs, verbs, and irregular verbs, and thankfully there aren't many irregular verbs in Japanese. We're going to learn some of these verbs, and we are going to learn how to conjugate them politely in what we can call the mas form, both in the negative and the affirmative. Then we're going to learn some particles. We're going to learn o, de, ni, and e. And all of these particles are going to allow us to use these verbs in different contexts to say different things. Then we're going to take a look at time references, saying when something is happening or when something happened. Even though we haven't learned the past tense yet, that isn't until lesson 4. So we're going to have to wait a while until we can talk about what happened yesterday. But yeah, then we're going to take a look at making polite invitations before moving on to frequency, how often we do something, and then word order, just a little bit about word order in Japanese, before finishing off with a little bit more about the wa particle, which we have been using up to this point quite frequently. So let's just get into it. So, like I said, there are 3 different categories of verbs in Japanese. We have reverbs, like taberu, to eat, miru, to see, to watch, okiru, to get up, neru, to sleep. And you can see that all of these verbs, what they have in common is that they end with the hiragana for ru. So, taberu, miru, okiru, neru. And they all conjugate in the same way. Next we have verbs like nomu, to drink, iku, to go, hanasu, to speak, and kaeru, to return. And you'll notice here that kaeru also ends with ru, but is still an verb. And the reason for that is that it conjugates like an verb rather than a ru verb. And we will learn how to conjugate this in just a minute. And then we have 2 irregular verbs, suru, to do, and kuru, to come. But not in the naughty way. Actually, to come in the naughty way is iku, to go. The more you know. The book is going to try to convince you to learn these verbs in a very strange way. It's trying to tell you to learn them as sats. So it's going to try to tell you to learn them as taberu and tabemasu. So both the dictionary form and the conjugated version of that same verb, which to me is absolutely insane. And there are maybe a few reasons for that. One of those reasons is that mas form is basically a grammatical dead end. And I know a lot of Japanese learners who have sort of had difficulties trying to unlearn this great emphasis on using the mas form. The reason it is emphasized is because it's very important to use mas form when you're speaking to someone maybe you don't know, or to your teachers. So in a Japanese learning environment with a Japanese teacher, you might have to be speaking in mas form all the time. But then when you make friends, ultimately, or hopefully, it won't be appropriate to use mas form all the time. it will feel a bit standoffish. You will be creating distance between you and your friends. So you have to learn that the dictionary forms, the plain Japanese, is just as valid. It just depends on the context. And anyways, we're going to be learning how to conjugate these verbs, so we don't need to memorize the conjugations as these verbs. You get it? So let's just memorize the dictionary forms of these verbs and then memorize and learn how to conjugate them, right? But you do you. That's just my advice. So looking at verbs, we have to conjugate them in an amazing way. And it's very simple. So we just take the last ru and replace it with mas or masen. So mas in the affirmative and masen in the negative. So for example, with taberu, to eat, taberu becomes tabemasu. Tabemasu also means to eat. It's also affirmative. And then we have tabemasen, to not eat. Miru, to see, to watch, becomes mimasu and mimasen. So ru, once again, replaced with mas and masen. And this is how it's going to be for all the ru verbs. So okiru, to get up, okimasu, to get up, and okimasen, to not get up. Neru, to sleep, becomes nemasu, to sleep, and nemasen. Great? So simple enough. As we move on to the verbs, it might seem a little bit more complicated, and I guess it is a little bit more complicated, but it's not as complicated as maybe the book would like you to believe, because all you're doing is moving the last sound over to the I category of the hiragana chart. I'll show you in a second. So becomes I, ku becomes ki, gu becomes ki, su becomes shi, because there's no C in Japanese, so su becomes shi, tsu becomes chi, because there's no T in Japanese, so tsu, chi, nu becomes ni, mu becomes mi, ru becomes ri, and this is important because there are some verbs that end with ru, so ru becomes ri, and bu becomes bi. And just to help you visualize this, we have this hiragana chart here. So you notice the u column. So u, ku, su. So verbs that end with these letters, they just move the last letter to the I column. So u becomes I, ku becomes ki, su becomes shi, etc., etc. And this is what it looks like in practice. So iku, to go. Sometimes in the naughty way. So iku becomes ikimasu. The last ku becomes ki. So iku, ikimasu, to go. Ikimasen, to not go. Yomu, to read. Maybe you're reading something naughty, I don't know. Yomu, to read, becomes yomimasu, yomimasu. And then yomimasen, to not read. Hanasu, to speak, becomes hanashimasu, to speak, and hanashimasen, to not speak. Kiku, to listen, becomes kikimasu, to listen, or kikimasen, to not listen. Matsu, to wait, becomes machimasu, to wait, or machimasen, to not wait. And then we of course have verbs that end with ru, like kaeru, to return. So kaeru. Kaeru ends with ru, but since it is a verb, it must be conjugated as such. So kaeru doesn't become kaemasu, it becomes kaerimasu. So ru becomes ri, kaerimasu, kaerimasen. So to return, kaerimasu, and to not return, kaerimasen. And at this point, many of you might become a bit nervous. How do I know which verbs that end with ru are ru verbs or u verbs? And my advice would be just to take it one verb at a time and learn them when you are learning them. Great advice. No, so the thing is that once you get a feel for it, you would never confuse kairu with a reverb, because not saying kairimasu or kairimasen would just sound off to you. And you are developing your own sense of Japanese, and as that sense becomes more accurate, stronger, this is something you don't have to worry about. So just take it one word at a time. Just be careful when you are learning them in the first place. That's the moment you worry about this, you wonder about this. But thankfully, in the Genki textbook, all the verbs are classified at the beginning of each chapter, so don't worry. So moving on to the last category of verbs, we have irregular verbs, which there are only two of, which is very nice. So we have suru, to do, becoming shimasu and then shimasen. And then we have kuru, to come, but not in the naughty way, becoming kimasu and kimasen. So there are no grammatical rules which you can follow in order to come to this conclusion. So you just have to learn these two verbs as they are. So kuru, notice here that kuru does not become kumas, it becomes kimasu and kimasen. Great. Now, with that out of the way, we can start to do some fun stuff. But in order to do the fun stuff, we kind of need particles to work with. Even though a Japanese sentence can basically just be a verb, you can say just tabemasu, to eat, and that can be a sentence in and of itself. You don't have to say I eat or I eat something. But we can, of course, also make these longer sentences in Japanese. One way to do that is with the o particle. So you'll notice that it's actually pronounced o as opposed to wo. You often see it written as wo when you're learning hiragana, but it's pronounced o. And it indicates some object that is directly affected or involved in some action. So for example, watashi wa yoku sushi o tabemasu. So I, speaking of me, yoku, often, sushi o tabemasu. So eat sushi. Sushi o tabemasu. Watashi wa yoku sushi o tabemasu. I often eat sushi. And then we can also say, Tanaka-san wa tokidoki terebi o mimasu. So Tanaka-san, Mr. Tanaka, speaking of him, tokidoki, sometimes, terebi o mimasu. So Tanaka-san sometimes watches TV. And here we have another fun word, sometimes being tokidoki, which is just fun to say, and not naughty at all, which is great. So here's what we have learned to say. We can say, watashi wa neko o kerimasu. So I kick a cat. Keru being to kick. Watashi wa neko o kerimasu. And you'll notice that this is also a verb that ends with ru. So keru becomes kerimasu. Watashi wa neko o kerimasu. But we still can't say watashi wa kawaii neko o kerimasu. So I kick a cute cat. And that's because we haven't learned adjectives yet. That's not until lesson 5. So stay tuned for that. But this is, of course, a grammatically correct sentence, even though it's something you maybe shouldn't do. You should only kick cats if they're not cute. No, don't kick cats. But speaking of kicking cats, these verbs, taberu, tabemasu, and all of that good stuff, can be described as action verbs, present tense, and they are mainly used to describe sort of habitual or future actions. So, watashi wa neko o kerimasu means either I'm going to kick a cat or I make a habit out of kicking cats. Don't do that. You do you. But anyway, but what I can't say yet is I am kicking a cat. So, watashi wa neko o ketteimasu. So, ketteimasu means I am kicking a cat. And this is basically the Japanese te form plus iru, which means to do something continually, and we will learn that later. So for now, make do with just kicking things habitually or meaning to kick things in the future. Moving on to the next particle, we have de. And this particle indicates where something is happening or what is used to do something. So for example, 図書館で本を読みます。図書館で本を読みます。So at the library, 本を読みます。So here we have O again. Read a book. 図書館で本を読みます。Or 手で. So this is 手. Hand 手で寿司を食べます。To eat sushi with your hands. 手で寿司を食べます。And that's the で particle. Next, we have ni, the ni particle. And ni indicates where something is going or when something happens. So for example, if you're going to school today, we can say 今日学校に行きます。今日学校に行きます。So today, 学校に行きます。To the school, go. But not in a naughty way. And then we have 10時に寝ます。So go to sleep at 10. 10時に寝ます。So go to sleep early, no time for naughty stuff. And lastly, we have the e particle, and you'll notice that this is written as the hiragana for he, but it's pronounced as e. And like the ni particle, it can describe the goal of movement, but not time. So we can't say 10時へ. So it's 10時に, so at 10 o'clock. So 学校へ行きません. I don't go to school. 家へ帰ります. I return home. And in some sense, this is a matter of preference. I mainly use ni personally. It is my sort of feeling that e is a bit more for the older generation. And there are some sort of set phrases. For example, Nihon e yokoso, so e yokoso, welcome to, where it would be more sort of common to use e than ni, I think. But in general, you can use either one, even though ni maybe is a little bit safer in many cases. But let's move on to an example dialogue. So, 何を飲みますか? So what are you drinking? 何を飲みますか? Or what will you be drinking? とりあえず生ビールを飲みます. So とりあえず for now. とりあえず生ビール so draft beer. とりあえず生ビールを飲みます. So for now I will drink a draft beer. And this is a very common phrase maybe in Japan. You can also just say とりあえず生で to get your draft beer for starters. じゃあ私も生ビールにします. Well then, 私も so me as well. 生ビールにします. So you can use にします to say that you're deciding on something, that you're going to pick something. So 生ビールにします。食べ物は So what are you going to eat? 食べ物は納豆を食べますか? Do you eat 納豆? This sort of fermented beans. 食べません. So 納豆を食べますか? 食べません. So do you eat 納豆? No, I don't make a habit of eating natto. I don't really eat natto, but I do recommend that you give natto a try. It's sort of an acquired taste, which I am still working on acquiring, but not in like a naughty way. So moving on to time references. We use ni, like we mentioned before, to mark the time. So, 土曜日に大学に行きません. So on Saturday, to the university, don't go. So I don't go to the university on Saturday, or whoever this sentence is referencing. So I could say, 田中さんは土曜日に大学に行きません。10時半に寝ます. So I go to bed at 10:30. Or 9月に, so in September, 9月に日本に行きます. And here you'll notice, just like in the first sentence, I just forgot to color it, that we have two ni, and they are performing different roles. So one of them is marking time, and the other one is marking direction of movement. So 9月 ni, the time, in September, Nihon ni, to Japan, go, but not in a naughty way. But there are also some time references that don't use ni. So for example, 明日行きます。毎朝歯を磨きます。いつ帰りますか? And I'll explain these. So one rule of thumb is that you don't need ni for time stuff or time references that are relative to the present moment. So for example, 今日, today, 明日, tomorrow, 来週, next week. So you don't need ni for that. You don't need ni for something that is happening all the time. So 毎朝, every morning, 毎晩, every night, 毎日, every day. And you don't need ni for question words like いつ, so when, いつ帰りますか, so when will you return? And just to translate these, because I just ran over them. So 明日行きます, I will go tomorrow. 毎朝, so every morning. 歯, this is teeth. 歯を磨きます. I brush my teeth. You should also brush them in the evening. And then lastly, いつ帰りますか? When will you return? いつ meaning when. いつ帰りますか? And then we have some time references where you are allowed to, where you are able to use ni, but it's basically a matter of preference. So for example, 夜, so evening. 夜に居酒屋に行きます. So in the evening, I go to an izakaya, also a Japanese pub in a way. You can either say yoru or yoru ni. So yoru ni izakaya ni ikimasu, or just yoru izakaya ni ikimasu. The same for morning, asa ni jimu ni ikimasu. So I go to the gym in the morning. Can either be asa jimu ni ikimasu or asa ni jimu ni ikimasu. And then 週末 meaning weekend, 週末に友達と遊びます. Or 週末友達と遊びます. Tomodachi meaning friend, and asobimasu meaning to play, and to meaning together. But not in like a naughty way. Or maybe, I don't know. I don't know how you play. So moving on to polite invitations, we have masenka at the end of a sentence. Masen being the negative conjugation of the verbs in the mass form, and then ka being the question ka we've used before. So, 一緒に映画を見ませんか means something like, won't you watch a film together with me? 一緒に meaning together, 映画 meaning film, and 見ませんか meaning won't you watch? And response to that could be いいですね. That sounds good. Or すいません、それはちょっと sorry, that's a bit out of my comfort zone, being the implication. So ちょっとbeing the sort of polite way of declining an offer. Moving on to frequency, we have some adverbs we can use to express how often or how seldom we do something. So for example, here in the green, we have 私は時々映画を見ます. So I sometimes watch films. Or 私はよく映画を見ます. よく meaning often. Or 私は毎日映画を見ます. I watch films every day. And then in the negative portion, where we have these negative adverbs, 全然 meaning never, and then あんまり meaning not often or not a lot, we have 佐藤さんは全然勉強しません. And then the verb at the end must also be negative. So, doesn't study at all. 佐藤さんは全然勉強しません. And I notice here that I forgot to put the furigana. So, excuse me, 勉強. So, 佐藤さんは全然勉強しません. Or, 佐藤さんはあんまり勉強しません. So, 佐藤さんは全然勉強しません means doesn't study at all. And あんまり勉強しません means doesn't study that much. Just be careful that it needs to be negative if it's negative and positive if it's positive. A little bit about word order in Japanese. So Japanese in grammatical terms is generally a subject, object, verb language, while English is subject, verb, object. So for example, in English we have I eat bread, while in Japanese it would be watashi wa pan o tabemasu. So the verb always comes at the end. Just like we saw maybe earlier with the frequency adverbs, we might be able to put those adverbs in different places in the sentence. But my advice at the moment would be just to sort of try to emulate what you see, what you hear, what you read, just to keep it natural. Because even though you can rearrange these things in different ways, and you often do, especially in speech, it might be good to try to just emulate what you are learning. So just stick with that for the moment. A little bit more about wa, the topic particle. The main point being that wa is a topic particle, meaning speaking of this, but it's not a subject particle, even though we sometimes use it as such in the Japanese that we have been learning. So, これはペンです. So here, this is the subject. So, これはペンです. And in this case, it can't be seen as marking the subject in a way. But we also have sentences like, 田中さん、今日は何をしますか? So, 田中さん, what will you be doing today? Here, 田中さん is the subject, but we have 今日は. So, speaking of today, what will you be doing? So it's not marking the subject itself, it's marking the topic of what we are talking about. And we can see this here in this example. So, 日本酒は? So, how about Japanese rice wine? So, osake. So what we tend to think of as sake in the West is actually nihonshu, so Japanese wine, Japanese alcohol. While sake in Japanese just means alcohol in general. So, nihonshu wa, so how about Japanese rice wine? And you could say nomimasu or nomimasen, depending on whether you're going to drink it or not. But just like with the previous slide, the wa here is not marking the actual subject of the sentence because the subject is the person who is going to be drinking. So, speaking of nihonshu, will you drink or will you not drink? And that's basically it, aside from this dialogue, which I forgot about. So, 明日、大学に来ますか? So, tomorrow, will you come to the university? 明日、大学に来ますか? はい、yes, 行きます. And this is important because when it comes to coming and going in Japanese, it depends on where you are located. So, for example, in this case, when the person is saying, 明日大学に来ますか? Because this person is using come to come, that person is located at the university at the moment. So, 明日大学に来ますか? And person B says, はい、行きます. So that person is not at the university at the moment. So, はい、行きます. Yes, I will go. 今日テストの準備をします. Today I will do preparations for a test. テストの準備 meaning preparation, and テスト meaning test. 今日テストの準備をします. Today I will prepare for the test. 頑張ってください. So do your best. 頑張ってください. Best of luck with that. And that concludes lesson 3. My biggest advice for the moment, or maybe it's just a personal preference, don't neglect kanji. Like you could see in this lesson, we have a lot of kanji, even though we also have hiragana. But these kanji are all fairly basic in the grand scheme of things. So you should be able to learn them and use them and not rely on the hiragana in the end. So don't neglect your kanji studies. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more Japanese language. and eventually culture. We'll see what the culture portion will be. At the very least, I'm looking forward to the fall lineup of anime. Or at least I'm looking forward to checking that out. I haven't really looked at it much. Hopefully there's some good stuff in there. I wouldn't mind talking about it. But until next time, mata ne.